What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Scales 13. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you guys the awesome benefits of leaf litter. Alright guys, so let's start off with a basic intro about what leaf litter actually is. So leaf litter is actually just fallen leaves that you'll find from trees and bushes in the wild. Now the question comes up, why would you want to put leaf litter in your reptile's enclosure? Well, there's a multitude of different benefits that your reptile would have by adding leaf litter to the animal's enclosure, right? Majority of them are going to fall under the umbrella of enrichment. So let's start off with our first reason. The first reason for adding leaf litter to your reptile's enclosure would be to encourage foraging behavior in your reptile. A lot of times we're feeding our reptiles out of bowls and using tongues, or even putting insects in the enclosure where the animal can see them easily and then it eats the food very quickly, which is good if you don't want any feeders running around the enclosure. But for the animal's brain, it's better to have the animal work harder to get the food like it would out in the wild, because it's going to bring out different aspects of the animal's hunting behavior that it wouldn't normally have, right? For example, let's say I'm feeding dubia roaches to my Ackie monitor, and I want him to hunt rather than me just feeding him off of tongs. Once scattered, the dubia roaches would run under the leaf litter, and then what Thunder would do is he would look at the leaf litter and watch the movements in the leaf litter, run over to it, start digging through it to find the dubia roaches, and he would also use his sense of smell with his forked tongue to locate them while doing this. It's awesome because it gives the animal a chance to use the tools given to it by nature through evolution in order to find its prey in a more natural way. Benefit number 2, substrate. So let's say you have an animal that likes to burrow and it likes its burrows to be nice and humid, right? How are you going to keep that humidity in the substrate? Well, we know it's going to dry out on the surface because the majority of our reptiles are going to have heating elements, right? So how do you keep this substrate moist for a longer period of time? Well, when you add leaf litter on top of the substrate, it's going to trap more of that moisture that would normally be evaporating out of the substrate within the lower layers of the substrate, and the substrate stays moist. So that would be an awesome benefit because then you don't have to spray down the enclosure as much, and for the sake of the reptile, the humidity is trapped in the substrate longer. So even if you have a busy schedule, you miss a day of missing the enclosure, something like that, the animal has more moisture that would last longer in the enclosure, right? Okay. Benefit number 3. Let's say you're going with a bioactive enclosure, right? You have springtails, you have isopods, and the main thing you want your springtails and isopods to do is be your cleanup crew. You want them to clean up the dung from your animal, and you want them to basically keep the enclosure as clean as possible, right? But let's just say you're starting a new bioactive enclosure. There's not a lot of dead, decaying material in there for the cleanup crew to feed on, right? What do you add? You add some leaf litter to the enclosure. Why do you do that? Because as the leaf litter breaks down, that's actually going to be food for your springtails and your isopods. And it can actually even be a staple food for them, whereas even if your enclosure doesn't have an animal in it for a little while, let's say you move an animal to a different enclosure and you don't have that enclosure running for a little while, right? As long as there's moisture, as long as there's food, your cleanup crew can survive in that enclosure until you use it again, right? That's why you would add the leaf litter, because the leaf litter is going to give them a staple food that they can feed on whenever necessary. Now, a few things when it comes to obtaining your leaf litter, right? Now, when you're going to get leaf litter, there's a couple different ways you can go about it. You can either buy commercially available leaf litter, which you can find on Josh's Frogs. You can find it on Amazon. You can even find it in places like Reptile. And of course, the Bio Dude has his own mixture of leaf litter that he sells commercially as well, right? Or you can go get it from outside for free. Now, if you're gonna get your leaf litter from outside and get free leaves, there's a few things you gotta keep in mind when you're doing this in order to collect your leaves safely, right? Number one, get freshly fallen leaves. Don't get leaves that have been sitting on the ground for like a year in that corner of your yard or something like that, where they've had time to get really dirty and break down. Even if you're getting leaves that have fallen, and let's just say you're doing your leaf cleanup for the fall time and you're getting them from a pile, I would only grab the leaves that have fallen right on top of that pile from the trees themselves. I wouldn't get the ones that have been rolled up on the ground. Why? Because if you look at a leaf after it's turned dark and you start getting those little white fuzzy spots on it, number one, it's already decaying. Number two, it's going to have a lot of mold on it, because from being down on the lower levels where all the moisture is in the wild, it's going to be food for all little mold spores that are on the ground. Now, of course, that is a natural thing, but when you're putting a reptile in an enclosure, especially if you have an enclosure that doesn't have a screen top lid on it, there's not a lot of open air. So you don't necessarily want to trap your reptile in the enclosure with leaves that you can physically see mold spores on there or have a high mold count on them, right? So what do you do in that aspect? Well, some people like to boil their leaves, bake them, do different things to sterilize them, right? Me personally, I take them off from outside, I give them a quick rinse, and I let them dry out completely before I put them in an enclosure. But the main thing that I do is I search for leaves that have just fallen, and I get leaves that have fallen, let's say, on the concrete, on the deck, or even if they fall on grass. Make sure these leaves have not been collected from areas that have been treated with pesticides, have been treated with herbicides, any chemicals that could harm your reptile. Because if those areas have been treated with any of these different types of chemicals, you're now putting those in your animal's enclosure, and your animal's gonna have chronic exposure to these chemicals. So be careful when you do your collecting. Of course, you're collecting these leaves as well. You want to make sure that you're not collecting them from an area that's private property or something like that. Don't just walk on somebody else's lawn or go in someone else's yard or property and say, hey, I'm just going to pick up some free leaves. No, do it in an area that's either a public area or your own property if you're going to collect these. And the third tip I'm going to give you guys, if you're going to be using leaf litter that you found out in nature, make sure that you know the tree that the leaf is coming from. This is a time to get used to identifying leaves by looking at the shape of the leaf and figuring out what tree it comes from. There's a few reasons why. The main reason why is because certain leaves aren't going to be good for your reptile to put in the enclosure with it, and certain leaves are. Also, chemical absorption. Hardwood trees don't absorb as many chemicals from the ground as softwood trees would. Now, the thing is, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you ever put leaves in your reptile's enclosure, and if they're from a softwood tree, that they're automatically going to get sick and you did a bad thing and blah, 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 blah. But it's just a better rule of thumb where if you collect, let's say, maple, oak tree leaves, things of that nature that aren't going to absorb as many of those dangerous chemicals from the soil or whatever's been treating in that area, 9 times out of 10, you're not putting as many chemicals into your reptile's enclosure if you use these leaves. All right, guys, so I hope you enjoyed this video. It was a lot of fun making. It was a lot of fun adding these leaves to my reptile's enclosure and watching them forage, watching them hunt, and just making their lives better. That's all we want to do here, is make the lives better of the pets that we're keeping. If you like this video, please remember to give it a like and a subscription if you're new to the channel. Everyone have a great day. Peace.